Mira a ver ahora. Estamos grabando. Es poco, es la luz de la pantalla, porque ahora acabo de encender para que me dé un poco más a eso. Sí, pero eso tiene un poco. Ah, bueno. No, te comento era porque si había un poco sin sentido.
Are we ready? Yes, we are. So today, we bring you a panel of judges that is exceptional. We have the best of the best, multiple Spanish championship winners, multiple world championship top 10 debaters, multiple CICAE winners. We have the best of the best. So I cannot present you every one of them. I will say their names and I will present the president, all right? I hope that's enough. So we have Ricardo, Daniel, Alejandro, Luis, Pablo Espinar, and the president, Matías. Matías is nearly an engineer, civil engineer. He has taken part in more than 30 tournaments across his life of debater. He is an ex-CICAE, and he has won every CICAE tournament, basically, that he's participated on. So, big applause for the jury, and big applause for the teams. So, you ready? Yes? So let's go for it.
Guys, beforehand, when the other team has a question, raise your hand, and one of the judges will raise our hands too, so you guys know the other team has it.
Imagine a man's arm is severely infected. Doctors warn him that if they do not amputate it, the infection will spread and he'll die. This decision is tragic and even painful, but it's necessary because sometimes to save the body, you must sacrifice a part of it. Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Fernando Arias, and together with my teammates, Elena Menacho, María Armada, Mencia Rayo, and Ángel Bartolomé, we stand firmly in favor of the question. In countries with serious internal conflicts and security problems, it's illegitimate to sacrifice fundamental rights in the name of public security. Before addressing our argument which answers the question, it is essential to establish a legal and conceptual framework which we base on 3 international treaties. The American Convention on Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights adopted by the United Nations. According to these treaties, the legitimacy of temporarily restricting certain fundamental rights applies to exceptional countries in which both the stability of the state and the safety of the citizens are seriously at risk. It is crucial to emphasize that we do not defend any sacrifice of rights. For instance, we do not defend the sacrifice of the right to life, the prohibition of torture, or the ban of slavery. We rather defend those strictly necessary and justified in these treaties. For example, the freedom of assembly and association, the freedom of movement and displayment, and the freedom of expression and press. Taking everything into account, we define legitimacy as something that is backed by law, is applied within a regulatory framework, and pursues a just and necessary goal to protect the well-being of society. Therefore, our team position itself completely in favor of the question proposed due to the fact that temporary restricting certain rights brings both short-term and long-term arguments. This thesis is grounded in the following two strong arguments. First, a short-term argument, and second, a long-term argument. Our first argument is based on the fact that in these countries with extreme situations, temporarily sacrificing certain rights is legitimate, as it protects the most fundamental one, the right to life. When criminals or armed groups control entire regions, people live in fear, unable to truly enjoy the freedom and stability supposedly granted by the state. In such context, safeguarding lives must take priority over defending abstract liberties. For instance, in El Salvador, the restriction of some rights have led to a historic drop in homicides, allowing citizens to regain control over their communities. Likewise, during the COVID-19 pandemic, temporary restrictions were proven to save millions of lives across the globe. Therefore, temporary sacrificing certain rights in a crisis is legitimate, as it ensures that one's safety is restored, true freedom and stability can be enjoyed. This leads to our second argument, the long-term argument, which defends that this measure is necessary because the security gained through it is the foundation of all other freedoms. Without this safety, citizens in the long term will not be able to enjoy rights, to participate in society, and of course will not be able to build a stable nation. For instance, in Rwanda, after the 1994 genocide, limiting certain rights temporarily allowed the government to stabilize the country, reduce crime, and eventually restore freedoms. In critical situations, sacrificing some rights is essential, and in fact, it is the only way to ensure that one's security is restored through freedom, stability, and prosperity can exist. Thank you very much.
This is a fragment of the Berlin Wall. For 23 years, it divided not only a city, but two ideas of humanity. One that promised protection through control, and one that believed control could exist only through freedom. But behind this concrete, millions lived without a voice, without choice, without truth. But because when a government begins to protect citizens from their very own rights, the only thing it does is become a prison. It stops being a government. This is what remains when nations trade liberty for control, walls, silence, and regret. And the lesson of history is clear, that these walls will only crumble under the weight of human dignity. And the pieces it leaves behind are a warning to those who ever again think that safety far outweighs security. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Alejandra Muller, and I will be representing the team against the question proposed, which is, in countries with serious internal conflict and security problems, is it legitimate to sacrifice rights in the name of public security? Before getting into this question, we first need to define some key terms. First, what is a fundamental right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, the FRA defines fundamental rights as those which are inherent to all human beings, regardless of age, race, sex, or any other such status that could therefore differentiate them. We defend the right to life, the right to privacy, and freedom of expression. We also need to look at internal conflict. It is generally understood as a situation in which organized groups engage in violent and prolonged confrontation that threatens the stability of a government and its ability to protect its citizens. Some examples of this are civil wars, terrorism, armed uprisings, and gang violence. We also, therefore, we answer this question with a firm and resounding no. We stand completely against the termination of some rights. We believe that even in times of crisis, it is not legitimate to sacrifice these rights, and doing so will only endanger democracy. To defend our point, our thesis stands on two fundamental arguments. First, political manipulation, in which we defend that rights are not returned, and governments abuse their position of power. We also stand for an alternate vision, in which we hope to build security through rights and not by undermining them. All this to say, the temporary sacrifice of fundamental rights only endangers democracy itself and creates deeper, longer-lasting instability. It will not strengthen democracy, ladies and gentlemen. It will only weaken it. History shows that the promise of temporary control is never temporary. It always becomes a permanent limitation. This can be seen in countries such as the USA with its 9/11 Patriot Act and North Korea, which my teammates will further explore in our line of argumentation. These arguments will be presented by my first refuter, and my second refuter will answer anything the opposition has to say and will leave you without a doubt that our position, in which freedom far outweighs security when a nation is faced with its possible collapse, is the only correct one. Thank you very much.
Dear jury, members of the opposing team and the audience, my name is Elena Minacho, and I'm the first rebuttal of a team that's completely in favor of the question proposed due to the fact that the temporary suspension of fundamental rights brings both short-term and long-term benefits. Before constructing my arguments, I will let you about some of the ideas proposed by the opposing team. However, firstly, I would like to say that the opposing team has developed their arguments in the introduction a bit late, so we didn't really get the chance to develop them very well. And in fact, they have not really developed their second argument, so... Alright, in the first argument, which is political manipulation, they affirm that rights are not returned and that they offer an alternative vision, and that the suspension of fundamental rights creates longer instability and it's never temporary. We would like to say that we do bring an example of a country that has succeeded in sacrificing their fundamental rights and has regained them, and in fact, there have been many long-term benefits from it. We will develop that in our second argument. Furthermore, the examples that the opposing team has talked about, North Korea and I think the United States, these countries don't really get into the debate because we're talking about underdeveloped countries. How can the United States be a developed country? Well, having rebutted these ideas, I'll proceed to construct our main arguments. I'll start with our first argument, which is a short-term argument. In countries where people live in constant fear and where governance is detached from the government, where gangs and militias hold real control over the people, the rights imposed by the state are meaningless. What's the point of having freedom of speech if speaking your mind in the street can get you killed? Before we defend abstract ideals, we must first guarantee the most fundamental one, the right to live. Your question, please?
You mentioned that some of the countries that we mentioned, like the USA, like North Korea, they don't have long-term, they're not unstable countries. However, what gives you the authority over those national governments to decide that?
Well, we are talking about countries with internal conflicts, and we do consider those countries that are more underdeveloped because these are the ones that have more internal conflicts. I'll continue with my development. The implementation of these measures, the suspension of rights, has saved far more lives than it has cost, as evidenced by the dramatic decline in El Salvador's homicide rates. In 2010, it was considered the most dangerous country in the world and recorded 127 deaths per day. That is 46,000 deaths in total. Today, the country has reached 1,000 days without a single homicide. These measures have not only changed statistics, they have saved thousands of lives. In the country, those who once lived without any rights under criminal dominance have regained them, and those who violated the law are now in jail. Furthermore, I would like to put another example of the suspension of these measures and its effectiveness. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the suspension of certain rights, such as freedom of movement or freedom of assembly, were accredited by numerous studies, with having saved 3.2 million lives in Europe. These measures were implemented responsibly, and societies eventually regained their rights. In the end, countless lives were saved. In fact, in Spain, we would not be here today if those measures had not been implemented. Regardless of the quality of the government's management, whether in El Salvador or during COVID, what remains undeniable is that countless lives have been saved. Furthermore, the suspension of rights is the very first step that will not only immediately solve internal conflicts, but it will also open the door towards long-term development. Your question, please?
How can you dismiss the countries that are more developed when the question does not specify what type of countries we're talking about? We're talking about if it is legitimate to sacrifice these fundamental rights.
Well, I'm not dismissing these countries. I'm just saying that the countries with more internal conflicts are the ones that are in a worse situation. We could talk about the United States, but the internal conflicts in other countries cause them the need to sacrifice fundamental rights. I'll proceed with our second argument, which is a long-term argument. Security constitutes the foundation of all liberties and is a necessary pillar that holds all rights and freedoms. Lasting national progress demands decisive action. By temporarily suspending certain rights and ensuring strong government measures, true security and stability can be achieved. Once security is settled, it will lead to many long-term benefits that will considerably improve the country's situation. Because, firstly, there will be a significant improvement in education, which gives people the chance to create their own future away from the cycle of violence, which is what we're aiming for, because this will reduce the presence of gangs and militias inside the country and therefore the threat that they suppose. Secondly, new social and political freedoms can emerge, as people will not only be able to exercise those rights that they did not have under criminal domination, but they will also be able to exercise the rights that they will regain with the suspension of rights. And finally, there will be an exponential economic growth, which is one of the most important points. Taking Rwanda as an example, where several rights were limited after the 1994 Rwandan genocide, the country's government has succeeded to recover, becoming one of the fastest growing economies in Africa, growing steadily at 7% every year. After regaining their rights, because Rwanda did regain their rights, it has proven to be the country with the lowest criminal rates in the continent, which proves the efficiency of these measures and of the suspension of rights. Thereby, in a nation facing a critical situation, firm and decisive actions are the most effective path towards restoring order and achieving collective prosperity. In that sense, temporary restrictions are not the end of rights, but the necessary step to make them real. Thank you.
Who are we to decide which sides live
and which side for safety. Because when a government claims the power to decide which freedoms can be taken away, it no longer protects its people, it rules them. Good morning, my name is Laura Modronio, first the future of the opposition, and to the question before us, our answer is a firm, reason, and absolute no. In this speech, I will do two things. First, refute to the proposition's illusion of necessary repression, and secondly, defend our political and alternative arguments. Mainly, in the introduction, they said that they were going to establish the debate on the short-term and long-term. However, they haven't established what they believe for short-term and long-term. Therefore, we believe that this is an undefined term which cannot be used as the main resource for the arguments online. And furthermore, we believe that they agree with us. Moreover, when they asked the questions, he said that North Korea did not work because it was the custom was based for underdeveloped countries. However, she contradicted herself when she used Spain as an example with COVID-19. Isn't Spain like a developed country with no significant internal conflict, which therefore brings back to the idea? Moreover, they base their debate on the right to leave. However, how can you be so sure that this government will respect their rights and not abuse them, which is the main core of this debate? Moreover, they also talked about safety. However, public safety is an undefined term that can justify anything. Without strict limits, it becomes a brown check for any abuse. Every restriction can be distinguished as safety because every government believes it acts for a purpose. That is why rights exist. To draw a line, power cannot cross, even when it claims good intentions, which is right back what we are here for. Now, regarding what they say about legitimacy, well, it comes from the people consent, not from the authority intention. A government that suspends rights without consent destroys the very foundation that grants it. And now you cannot call a measure for the common good, because if those affected are not allowed to question it, then protection without consent is not protection, it is domination. Now, I'm going to continue with my arguments in line. It started with my political argument as we saw that it was vaguely refuted. So, members of the jury, our political warning is clear. When a government takes right in the name of a crisis, those rights almost never return because the power to end the emergency lies in the very hands that benefit from prolonging it. Every democracy eventually faces moments of fear, instability, and uncertainty. But here lies the danger. The same government that gains extraordinary powers during a crisis is the one who decides when the crisis is over. This doesn't make any sense. And the hands that hold exceptional powers never rushes to release them. This is the fundamental political flaw. A complete cause of accountability. So, if those who restrict rights are also the ones who judge the necessity of those restrictions, the powers to prevent themselves as temporary becomes permanent. And because when leaders discover that fear grants them power, they do not try to eliminate it, but they try to learn how to use it. The evidence is clear, as this pattern is not theoretical, but historical. We can see this with North Korea, as in North Korea execute its people for seeing foreign movies and TV. We want to sacrifice freedom at the cost of our own lives. Moreover, we have seen this in the 9/11 surveillance laws were introduced as temporary measures. 20 years later, those laws still remain, which is something like the other opposition countries not saying. These are not isolated events. This is the global pattern of fear. Let us examine the impact. Mainly, they claim that order must come before liberty, that restricting rights today protect their rights tomorrow. But ask yourself, if the government decides both what the danger is and when the danger ends, then what is a right? A guarantee or a privilege granted at the discretion of power? Because a right that can be taken away whenever the state declares an emergency is not a right, it is a permission slip. And democracy cannot rest on permission. In conclusion of this first argument, members of the jury, rights do not survive because the state is powerful. Rights survive because the state is accountable. And once you remove accountability, once you allow fear to justify exceptional authority, you're not protecting liberty, you're handing it away. So we leave you with this truth. The greatest threat to freedom is not chaos. It is the power that claims it must save us by taking away freedoms. Now, I'm going to continue with my second argument, the alternative, which is the main core of this debate, as they have not produced how they are going to tell. So members of the jury, our alternative is simple and powerful. A nation becomes safer when it strengthens rights, not when it destroys them. The proposition is that safety requires surrendering freedom, but this danger is illusion. Fear may control citizens for a moment. Only justice protects them for a lifetime. Repression can force obedience, but it can never create peace. Because peace is not the silence of fear, it is the presence of trust. And trust is only born when people know what the law protects them, not persecutes them. And I see that comes through rights, comes through respect, and no weapon in history has ever lasted longer than the respect of his people, members of the jury. Let's look at the evidence. We have seen that in South Africa, reconciliation, not revenge, rebuilt a nation from ashes. Now the GDP is increasing at rates they have never experienced. Moreover, in Costa Rica, a country without government for 70 years, peace has come not from violence, but from education and democracy, and now unemployment rates are the lowest rates they have ever been. Your question?
You've explained and you've brought up the example of the USA. However, what fundamental rights were suspended in this country?
Well, as I said, the fundamental rights that were suspended were that people could not actually have a say and were accountability to the government. Moreover, related to the idea that this rate generates. Now I'm going to continue reconstructing my argumental line. So, these are not exceptions. They are the proof that liberty fortifies a nation more strongly than ever that fear could. Let's see to the impact. Imagine two countries. One where people obey out of fear, and another one where people cooperate because they believe in the system, in the law, and in each other. Which one would survive a crisis? Which one would rebuild faster? And which one would you trust for your family's future? So, members of the jury, the safest nations are not those that keep their citizens, but those whose citizens stand ready to defend their freedom. And I ask you, who are you to decide which rights must die so others can live? The right to speak, the right to dissent, the right to hold leaders accountable. These are not luxuries of peace, they're the guardians of peace itself. If a nation must break its own rights to defend security, then what's really insecure? The country or the countries that once made it free. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, dear members of the jury, opposing in audience, and the secretary part of the team that stands itself completely in favour of the question proposed due to the fact that the temporary restriction of fundamental rights brings both short and long-term benefits. I will divide my intervention in this debate into, firstly, I will rebut the arguments presented by the opposing team, and then I will proceed to reconstruct those of our own. Firstly, I would like to explain, because the opposing team said they hadn't understood the difference between short and long term, therefore I will explain it further. Short term is the immediate impact which we have proven in saving lives. Example 2018, before Brigades arrival to the government, 127 lives per day. Today, 1,000 days without homicides. This is what we define by short term. And this short term, once we've set the basis for security, allows us to go on to the long term, as we cannot appeal to putting ends to poverty, marginalization, whatever, when there is insecurity. I mean, it doesn't make sense to build schools when children can go to school, etc. Therefore, the complementation of these two measures is what will make possible a prosperous future. Now, I will teach you about directly the opposing team's arguments. Firstly, we present a political manipulation argument, in which they mention that rights are not repaired. Governments' abuse of rights jurisdiction endangering democracy, which they state as a norm, and falls into a fallacy of generalization because they just cannot generalize this for all the cases. In fact, we bring clear cases in which this doesn't happen, which I will mention before. They mention state abuses, but the question of debate is already given that the fundamental rights are being sacrificed in the name of public security. In that case, we're being asked to rely entirely on the goodwill of the government. By answering this, the question, we're only legitimizing the sacrifice of certain rights when the aim is genuine public security, not authoritarianism. Furthermore, I would like to define the concepts of violation and sacrifice. Sacrifice is when the state temporarily suspends certain rights following legal procedures, usually a state of exception, when the state trespasses legal limits in disobedience of the state of exception. The state of exception expands powers, but it does not authorize abuses. Violation is an individual or institutional transgression. They are distinct phenomena. One is legal and the other one is crime. This doesn't prove that the measure was wrong, but it was wrongly executed. Wrong execution does not mean wrong measure. And in fact, the suspension of rights can be done legally and democratically, as we've already proven with Rwanda. Rwanda managed to use effectively, starting from absolutely nothing. Any other country which has a bare minimum law, or even in the same situation, which was nothing, will be able to do the same. We also proved this with COVID, something we've all experienced. Let me tell you that if these measures hadn't been imposed, 3.2 million people would have died. 450,000 in Spain alone. From France during the terrorist attacks of 2015, suspended rights constitutionally, and then effectively restored them. Your question, please.
In reference to your earlier point, how do you expect citizens to advocate for themselves and rights such as education, as you have said, if they lack the very right to do so?
Yes, I was exactly saying that. In countries with serious internal conflicts, children cannot be educated. Therefore, we set the base, we restore security, and then it is effective that education can be reinstalled. Therefore, I would also like to say that they mentioned the USA as an example of rights not being regained. However, the US is actually a democracy, and that is undeniable. And furthermore, they say that these measures lasted for a certain period of time, and no other terrorist attack has occurred since then. So therefore, actually, they were giving us the reason, saying that these measures have been effective. You also mentioned North Korea. However, North Korea is a dictatorship. Dictatorships restrict rights, but this is in no case in the name of public security, which is, again, the question we're here debating today, which, therefore, this is irrelevant. Regarding their second arguments and alternative arguments. Now, we haven't really understood what the alternative is. They mention South Africa and Costa Rica, but they don't say in what the alternatives consist. Therefore, we cannot rebut this idea. South Africa, again, the same as Korea. In South Africa, if they're speaking about apartheid, which we don't know because they really don't specify, it was a dictatorship and segregation, racist against people of color. Therefore, obviously, in dictatorships, rights are always restricted, but this is not in order to restore public security. Therefore, I would like to reconstruct our argumentative line. We base our arguments on short-term arguments and long-term arguments. And our team still stands firmly in favor of the question proposed, due to the fact that the temporary restriction of certain rights brings both short and long-term benefits. Thank you very much.
Hello, Hello everyone, my name is Guillermo Carmona. I will be doing the second Hello everyone, my name is Guillermo Carmona. I will be doing the second rebuttal for the team against. Now, look, we have a lot to get into, so let's just dive right in. The first thing I want to comment on and critique is the very basis of their argument. In their intro, they said that, sometimes taking away rights is quote-unquote necessary. They compare it to an infection. This is just completely wrong and unsubstantiated. The very democracy we live in right now was caused after Franco's dictatorship, when we instituted rights through a constitution. We also referenced countries like South Africa, which used rights to create a better democracy and society. They are absolutely not. It's not absolutely necessary to take away rights. Furthermore, they also pick and choose some rights to take away and some rights to not take away, which is just a complete misunderstanding of how the taking away of these rights would work. Okay, once you take away all, you set the president. Once you take away one right, you set the president to take away them all. Okay, there is no hierarchy, and if there is, you completely lack. You didn't mention what it is. Okay, now let's just dive right into their first argument. This argument of short-term and prosperity when we take away rights. They have kind of two pillars of support. First of all, their introduction mentioned COVID-19 and mentioned how the right to movement was violated and helped treat the disease. This COVID has no place in this debate because it's a pandemic. Okay, it happened in multiple continents. It's in absolutely no way an internal conflict. The next pillar that they really are supported by is El Salvador. Okay, they mentioned how El Salvador homicides has really decreased. They make something up. They say that there's been no homicides for 1,000 days. It's just completely wrong. But they are right. Homicides have decreased. Yes, question. Oh.
Is millions of people dying not a security problem?
Stop. Oh, you can't over-exaggerate and say it's millions of people. Yes, many people did die, okay? But let's get our numbers straight. And let's talk about what it is right now, because we also have to consider what it is under this new government. In this new government, thousands of people are taken to jail, and tens of thousands of people are taken to prison with no due process, and thousands of people have died. The worst thing is, we don't even know how many people died because there is no independent media fact-checking these governments. So you yourself have to speculate on their effectiveness. And furthermore, let's say we ignore the ethical considerations of this new government, which we should absolutely not do, but let's ignore them for a second. Okay, let's talk about the new economy under the Bukele government. Foreign direct investment has dropped substantially. Okay, the IMF Bank has taken away a $1.3 billion loan to El Salvador. Why? Because the very rights that you're saying that we should violate, that is what caused these banks to take away their offer. Okay, their economy is suffering in short term, and also it looks like it's going to suffer even more in the long term because as more time passes, less and less institutions trust the Salvadorian government. Now, I also want to use my own example, which is the example of Israel. Okay, recently after let me explain. Okay, after October 7th, after the attack in Israel decided to attack Palestine, okay, and has violated several human rights, even according to the UN, okay? But yet we see, after several years, nothing has changed. They're still under war. Under your framework, this would not be the case. Let's move on to the long-term argument that they have. They think that the only way to ensure security is through taking away rights, and that these rights would be given back. Yes, question?
Are you conscious that economy has grown up to 300% in La Campanera, region of El Salvador?
I mean, you can point to one specific reason, but we're talking about the entire national government. You're just cherry-picking one specific region and acting like that's, generalized for the whole government. That's just a very, unfaithful way to conduct the evidence. Now, let's look at the long-term evidence that they give. They reference Rwanda as their main evidence. To be honest with you, this is very cherry-picked evidence, okay? They don't really reference which rights were taken away, and more importantly, how the violation of rights has helped them take them to where they are, okay?
they don't even mention it. I would say many of these things that they say is as a result of the violation of human rights could be attributed to other factors. It's almost as if there's a society outside of Rwanda. And even if, let's play by their book, say all of the good things that have happened to Rwanda is because of this violation of human rights, we have our own evidence. South Africa, which is seen as one of the most progressive and free countries in Africa, and they did it through rights. So even if the best case scenario, South Africa is in the exact same position as Rwanda, wouldn't you agree that by doing it through human rights, it is way more legitimate and humane than taking away those human rights to do the same results? Now, with this bit of time I have left, I want to really support our arguments that they tried to debunk. Okay, the first thing they said was they kind of pushed off and brushed off our examples of the US and I think North Korea, right? They basically said that under their framework, these countries are not unstable and cannot be used. The truth is, your framework doesn't matter to these countries, okay? When we set the precedent that El Salvador can take away rights, we also set the precedent for, the President of the United States to say we're under a state of emergency and take away those very rights. This is kind of a naive notion that we can only do it in some countries, but the other countries won't do it. As you yourself say, we are entirely dependent on government, but you lack the critical thinking, the reasoning, and the truth, and and you lack the understanding that that's not true. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. I'm Jimena Bravo, my team's concluder, and I would like to start by letting us remember that from the beginning we defended that restricting fundamental rights in the name of public security is never the answer in the case of countries with severe internal conflict. Our answer to this question remains a clear and unshakable no. Throughout this debate, our argument line has remained consistent and strong every refutation. I would like to start by our second refuters debunking of their basis of their argument line, which they said that sometimes taking away rights is legitimate, but we defended ourselves clearly with South Africa's example that my second refuter showed. Then he continued by deconstructing their two pillars of their first argument, which was the short-term restoration and the long-term benefits. He first said that the COVID-19 that they stated as such evidence was a pandemic and not an internal conflict, which is the main issue of this debate. And then he said that El Salvador's deaths are not reported because of the lack of independent media, which they also showed as evidence. And a 1.3 billion offer was taken away because of the violation of human rights that this country committed, which he also clearly showed. Then he proceeded to deconstruct the second argument, which is the security as the foundation of all other freedoms, when he said that Rwanda's evidence was with Rwanda's evidence, there is no mention of the benefits of taking away the human rights. On the other side, our evidence, South Africa, was a better example of a situation when security was built through rights, was clearly is directly related and supporting our alternative argument, which is building security through rights and not against them. They tried to debunk our first argument, which is once rights are taken, they're really given back, saying that we're speaking about underdeveloped countries, referring to our examples, which were North Korea and the United States, saying they were invalid. But my team still doesn't know when this was stated in the debate. When were we talking about underdeveloped countries? They answered their argument to our first argument with the generalization of the issue, was like
We still don't know what they mean by that. And then we said, we used as evidence the USA Patriot Act, which is clear evidence of when rights were not taken away. And they responded with that the US is a democracy, which doesn't directly relate to our argument. And then they stated that they couldn't refute our second argument because we didn't say what the alternative consists on, which, as I said, was building security through rights and not against them. Ladies and gentlemen, the Berlin Wall fell. Today, new walls arise. Digital surveillance, emergency laws, and regimes that promise protection in exchange for rights. Our answer must remain the same as in 1989. No wall, no fear, and no power is above human dignity. Because when we value security over freedom, we're rebuilding the very wall that our parents once tore down. Thank you very much.
Dear jury, public, and members of the opposing team, our team is very grateful for having the opportunity to participate in this debate and to answer the following question. In countries with severe internal conflicts, is it legitimate to sacrifice fundamental rights in the name of public good, in the name of public security? My name is Nithya Rayo, and I come here as the final speaker of this debate. It'll be my job to finish my team's intervention, summarizing briefly but effectively the trajectory of this debate. My team stands firmly in favour of the question proposed, due to the fact that the temporary suspension of fundamental rights brings both short-term and long-term benefits. I will start by commenting on the principal confrontational arguments that have emerged during this debate. Regarding the first clash, it occurred between the political manipulation argument, in which they state that rights are not returned to the population. However, we rebutted this with a long-term argument, in which we defend that the security is a foundation upon which all freedoms and rights rest. The positive outcomes are many of restraining these rights and enforcing stronger measures. We can improve education, regain freedoms, and gain new rights that were previously impossible to exercise. The second collision occurs between their alternative argument and our short-term argument, in which we demonstrate and prove that the protection of life is the most fundamental human right, without which all other freedoms are meaningless. Rights may exist only in paper in certain countries ruled by violence and fear, and the temporary suspension of certain liberties can be justified when it restores safety and prevents widespread death. We've got several rich examples, such as COVID-19 and El Salvador's dramatic, and Rwanda, and many more. Before continuing, I would like to mention certain unjust things that have taken place during this debate. I will start one by one. The first one, the introductory speaker defined the arguments in the last minute, not giving us the time for first reporter to answer, apart from not defining the second argument. Secondly, the opposing team hasn't defined the alternative clearly, depriving us from the opportunity to answer properly. Thirdly, the opposing team only refutes us by stating said abuses. However, we have rebutted this idea time after time by saying that abuses are not done in the name of public security, and alternative abuse proof and in the name of public security, and furthermore, abuse proves a wrong execution, not a wrong measure. The next thing that occurred was that the opposing team said that COVID-19 was an exaggeration. We have all lived through COVID-19, as my teammates mentioned. How can you call that an exaggeration? In fact, we even brought up evidence to back this up. The next thing that happened was that the opposing team completely made up numbers about the deaths in Salvador, when my team said that we made them up, when my team provided clear evidence from a veridic place that these were solid numbers. The opposing team keeps bringing up problems and fallacies in the R2, knowing full and well that we cannot respond. Having said this, my team stands firmly in favour of the question proposed. Thank you very much.